I don't think I'll ever forget the summer of 2020. Despite a pandemic raging from coast to coast, after the murder of George Floyd, Americans of all races and backgrounds were protesting side by side.
What do you want? Justice! When do you want it? Now! What do you want?
Justice!
When do you want it? Now!
For what felt like the first time, Americans were also engaging with our racist history and seeking out stories of Black resilience and triumph.
As a historic preservationist and Somali American focused on preserving Black history, it was incredible to see the stories of Black Americans finally getting their due. It was during this time that I discovered a blog post about a 19th century Black woman named Biddy Mason. Biddy's story blew me away.
The blog post was written by architectural historian Laura Voisin George.
I am an architectural historian, a native of Southern California, and I am also in the PhD program in history at University of California, Santa Barbara.
As Laura was researching a 1930s WPA mural at the University of California, San Francisco's medical school, she discovered that it featured Biddy, working right alongside a well-known doctor.
There is this woman of color, and she has become a nurse, and she's working next to the leading doctor and surgeon in Los Angeles.
Laura is part of the Long Road to Freedom Project, the group of Biddy super historians we introduced you to last episode, who include professors Sally Gordon and Kevin Waite. When Laura joined in early 2020, she told them about the mural right away.
I had mentioned to them, hey, do you know there's this mural used in San Francisco? And they said, yeah, can you write us a blog about it?
In June 2020, Laura called UCSF to ask some questions about these paintings.
She found out that the medical hall was slated to be demolished, and with it, the murals.
UCSF wanted to demolish UC Hall as part of their plan to redevelop their Parnassus campus, and part of that was a new hospital. Also realized this is during 2020, and we did have a pandemic on. So arguments about, we need a new hospital, were very strong in those days. And I told Sally and Kevin and said, well, Laura, go do something. It's like, okay.
So Laura hooked up with a group of people in San Francisco and got to work.
So we began to put a lot of pressure on the university. We began to do it through letters to newspapers, to editors, to doing radio appearances, to posting handbills around San Francisco, right? Just really raising public awareness.
They started gaining traction, thanks largely to Biddy.
The title of the New York Times article in August was, "A Black Nurse Saved Lives, Now She May Save Art." So I think Biddy's being a woman of color at this point perhaps raised the importance of the issue than it just being art. As each new article, each op-ed came out, it sort of snowballed. San Francisco was coming forward and saying, don't do it. The community is coming up and saying, hell no. And so by about August, the university saw the writing on the wall.
While UCSF has publicly committed to preserving the murals, the fight is not over. Right now, the murals are sitting in storage, waiting for a more permanent home.
Laura has an idea of where the murals should go.
This new hospital they're so excited about building, it's going to have a huge atrium waiting room. Big enough for, 10 panels. So we think that they should be reinstalled in the new building.
And what do you think that would mean for Biddy's legacy if it were reinstated publicly accessible?
I think it would be an amazing message, right? Especially if we could tell the whole story about how these murals were even here today because of Biddy. And hopefully hyperlinks or QR that will send them to where they get a lot more information.
QR code to our podcast episode.
Absolutely, right? Click here.
The mural tells the story of Biddy the healer, but that's only one part of her legacy in California. There's Biddy the real estate mogul, Biddy the philanthropist, Biddy the godmother of Black LA.
Despite her importance to Californian history, the courthouse where Biddy's freedom trial was held is gone. Her first home, too. Her real estate properties, if still standing, have no markers. In some ways, the fight to preserve Biddy's presence in California has already been lost.
But there are traces of her legacy left, if you know where to look.
Welcome to Urban Roots, a podcast from Urbanist Media that dives deep into little-known stories of urban history. We're your hosts. I'm Della Hussein Wetzel, a historic preservationist.
And I'm Vanessa Quirk, a cities journalist. In our previous episode, we told you about Biddy Mason's remarkable beginnings, how she was born into slavery in Mississippi, earned her freedom in one of the largest freedom suits in American history, and then went on to become one of the most well-respected healers in Los Angeles.
Today, in the second of our two-part series on Biddy, we're telling the final half of her story, how she went from owning nothing at all to becoming a wealthy entrepreneur who built the foundations of Black Los Angeles.
And we'll tell you how the group of organizers and historians who we started to introduce you to last episode are keeping Biddy's memory alive. When we left Biddy last, she was recently emancipated, working for the famous Dr. Griffin as a nurse and midwife, and living with the Owens family in Los Angeles.
It wasn't entirely clear to her, I think, what freedom would mean in Los Angeles. LA in 1856, it was basically a cow town. There is no downtown. There's just the Central Plaza and the homes and the businesses that abutted it.
That's Kevin Waite, the historian from Durham University who you may remember from our previous episode. Kevin told us that even with the offer of a home and a job, Biddy was pretty brave to stay in LA with her daughters.
There were just a couple of Black families. The city was overrun by young white men from the slave states. So it was not a hospitable place for a freed woman and her 3 African-American daughters to settle.
But Biddy had good friends, the Owens, for support.
As you might recall from our last episode, Biddy's daughter Ellen had met and fallen in love with Charles Owens in San Bernardino. Once they were married, the Mason-Owens families were officially joined.
While Ellen found love with the Owens, Biddy found friendship, as well as some business savvy. You see, Robert Owens was a well-respected businessman, and by living with him and talking with him over dinner and whatnot, Biddy learned quite a bit about investing in property.
Her employer, Dr. Griffin, was also an investor in real estate and a good friend of Benjamin Wilson, an early mogul of LA real estate.
Who knows how many conversations between these men that Biddy overheard, or that she even took part in herself. I mean, it might seem unlikely that an African-American woman in the 1860s would have been having these kinds of conversations with white landowners. But then again, Biddy was no ordinary woman.
She had this uncanny ability to befriend almost everybody she came in contact with. She crossed the color line with remarkable ease. It was unusual, I would say, for an African-American formerly enslaved woman to have the allies and the friends that she did. Pio Pico, one of the wealthiest landholders in LA, and in fact the last Mexican governor of California, was one of her sort of allies and patrons. I've studied slavery for quite a while, and I can't think of too many other figures who were part of such a large, diverse, and unusual collection of people.
And who knows how much intel Biddy picked up traveling across the city for her medical work.
After 10 years of working as a healer, saving up her money, making friends, and paying attention to the real estate around her, Biddy was ready.
She bought her first property in 1866. Land was still relatively cheap, and she came to own some properties in what's really now the heart of downtown Los Angeles.
Once she had bought her first property, she leveraged it to make money so she could buy more.
She was very entrepreneurial. She built storerooms and residential properties on her real estate, and then she used the rents from those properties to sort of seed other investments. She was bringing in money from her work as a nurse. She was bringing in money from the rents that she charged her tenants, and she may have even been making some money from commercial enterprises. For a woman who was never taught to read and write, I think remarkable doesn't begin to sort of capture it.
UPenn law professor Sally Barringer Gordon agrees.
In the 19th century, women had limited legal rights, especially married women. In many jurisdictions, married women could not own property separately from their husbands. And Biddy, who never married after she was emancipated, became a significant property owner and property holder.
Jackie Broxton of the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation thinks that Biddy's desire to acquire property Maybe part of the reason that she never married as a free woman.
You know, a lot of white women have asked me, well, did Biddy ever get married? Did she find true love? And I said, I don't think she was looking for it. You know, she found comfort in being able to take care of herself and her children and provide a foundation for her family.
Biddy didn't believe in keeping her wealth just within her family. One of the first things she did when she purchased her own home was to open it up to LA's Black community for prayer meetings.
And then that graduated into a religious service. And from there, they actually later got a physical structure.
Out of Biddy's living room, the first African American Methodist Episcopal congregation, or FAME Church, was born. It's the oldest African American house of worship still operating in Los Angeles.
FAME now lives in the historic West Adams Heights Sugar Hill neighborhood, in a very impressive mid-century building designed by the famous African American architect, Paul Revere Williams.
Just a short walk away from the church is a small, unassuming bungalow that houses the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation, which spun out of the church in 2013. I asked two friends of mine who live in LA, Jane and Adrian, to meet Jackie Broxton, its executive director there.
We're the volunteers. Beautiful.
Oh, wow.
For years, Jackie and her foundation colleagues worked out of their garages. This is the first time they've had a headquarters of their own.
Jackie and her team are decorating the space now with unique pieces of furniture, art by people of color, as well as artifacts that speak to Biddy's story.
We want to educate the community to Biddy Mason's legacy. Because a lot of people who've lived here all their life, they know nothing about her.
Jackie showed Jane and Adrian some treasured photographs over the living room fireplace.
There's an old photograph of the route that Biddy walked from Salt Lake City to San Bernardino.
A photograph of Judge Benjamin Hayes.
Judge Benjamin Hayes, who granted her freedom, along with the document itself.
A copy of the deed to the first piece of property Biddy purchased.
This is her grandson.
They even have a reproduction of the UCSF mural hanging on a wall.
But the foundation doesn't just keep Biddy's legacy alive with artifacts. It also does it through its initiatives supporting foster youth.
This building will be a place where foster youth can come and get services and support.
It will also soon provide transitional housing for people aging out of foster care.
Most slaves were orphans, so she would relate to what we call foster kids, what we used to call orphans.
The roots of the foundation's philanthropic work can be directly traced to FAME, to those first meetings in Biddy Mason's living room. So we asked Jackie to tell us more about FAME's start.
Now, there were 8 other men who were the original trustees along with her. They were all former slaves. Most of them were barbers or laborers or teamsters.
Lewis Green was one of those 8 men.
Lewis Green sued the city to be able to vote. And once he got the right to vote, then the other 7 men registered to vote.
All of them had to navigate systems that tried to deny them power, wealth, and even basic security and safety.
There was so much racial prejudice in the early Los Angeles community. I think they probably felt like they needed to band together to protect themselves.
This feeling likely heightened in the wake of the Chinese massacre of 1871.
By some accounts, this massacre was one of the largest mass lynchings in American history.
It all started because of a false rumor that Chinese immigrants were killing whites. Hundreds of white and Hispanic men attacked the city's Chinatown.
19 people were killed. The dead represented more than 10% of the Chinese people in Los Angeles.
Jackie thinks events like these made Biddy and her compatriots realize that they needed a safe place to meet.
There weren't a lot of places for Black people to go. They needed the shelter of the church emotionally.
Biddy and these other men start First AME at just the right time, just before LA's Black population explodes. Here's Kevin Wade again.
Nobody predicted that LA would become the second biggest city in the country in the mid-19th century. It wasn't on that trajectory. Really, it was in the 1880s that began to all change. That's when LA had 2 major railroad lines. And because of the sort of the rapid travel and the cheap fares that those railroads offered, you got an influx of immigrants. In 1880 itself, there were just about 100 Black residents in the city. But by 1890, that number had jumped to about 1,200. And this is when Black LA itself begins to take shape. And it's really built around First African Methodist Church. This church was, in a lot of ways, the nexus of Black spiritual and political and social life. I mean, the Black church was so important to freed communities all over the country, and that wasn't any exception in LA. So again, it's Biddy's fingerprints that are all over the most important developments in the city's early history.
By the late 19th century, African Americans owned more real estate in LA than anywhere else in the country, thanks in huge part to Biddy's precedent.
As Biddy's chosen home was transforming from frontier backwater to bustling city, Biddy's wealth was growing.
According to Professor Sally Gordon, throughout her life, as Biddy earned wealth, she put it back into her community.
Biddy built orphanages. She built schools. She opened food kitchens. She welcomed new people of color arriving in Los Angeles. She provided them with a place to stay. She gave them jobs. She built success for others in addition to her own success.
And she tended to the sick and to the poor. She fed the victims of the flood of 1884, which left about a third of LA homeless. She was a tireless philanthropist.
Biddy Mason left a sizable estate. It's been estimated at $300,000 in 1891, which translates into more than $8.5 million today. All that despite having given away so much.
When Biddy died at the age of 73, her family couldn't hold her funeral at Fame Church. It just wasn't big enough to hold all the people who wanted to pay their respects.
She died a very wealthy woman, a revered figure, a notable philanthropist, and one of the real founders of the African American community in Los Angeles.
After Biddy's death, her grandson, the son of Ellen Mason and Charles Owens, took over the family business.
She gifted him a large portion of her fortune in her will when she died in 1891. And he built upon that wealth by erecting commercial properties on the parcels of land that Biddy herself gave to him. Probably the most prominent example was the Owens block, which was one of the more fashionable commercial blocks in the city. And it made Robert Owens probably the richest African-American west of Chicago. And this is really the sort of beginning of the Owens-Mason dynasty, which was for the next 60, 70 years, far and away the most influential and wealthy African-American family in Southern California.
Today, however, none of Biddy's descendants own the land she or her grandson developed.
Kevin, Sally, Jackie, and others in the Long Road to Freedom Project are trying to piece together where all her properties are located.
Our hope is that we'll be able to put a commemorative plaque on each place that she actually owned, even if it's a parking lot now.
However, the location of Biddy Mason's first property on Spring Street is known. Jackie told us that back in 1988, Fame members and city officials decided to build a park there in her honor.
When Jane and Adrian went to visit Jackie Broxton, she told them they had to check it out. So they got in their car and drove downtown.
You've arrived.
Okay.
I really don't see it. That's just buildings.
Huh. And it's on this side of the street?
It says we're here.
Turns out the Biddy Mason Memorial Park is hidden, sandwiched between two high-rises.
Okay, this is not it.
Are you sure? There's
no
way to get to it. I'm not seeing any way to get... Oh, maybe it's down here. It's got to be down here. Okay.
Once you discern the entrance, you leave the city behind and enter into this calm, open concrete plaza with leafy camphor and jacaranda trees.
This is really cool. You would not know this was here.
In the back of the plaza, there's a long, dark concrete wall. Etched into it are pictures and words that tell the story of Biddy's life.
But as Jane and Adrian found out, even though the park is in one of the most popular blocks in LA, it's easy to walk right past.
It's not something that people walking through downtown exploring are going to see.
Yeah.
I mean, we never saw this, and we've eaten at the restaurant that's right
next door. Yeah.
We probably walked past it hundreds of times and never seen it. It's literally hidden. So yeah, clearly she was prominent and important. But yeah, like so many other Black Americans, her accomplishments and her memorials didn't.
Biddy Mason's descendants would like to rename Spring Street to Biddy Mason Street because right now you can walk around all of downtown Los Angeles and not see a trace of Biddy at all.
When we asked Kevin Waite and Laura Voice and George where they most see the legacy of Biddy today, they both suggested we don't look to the physical realm at all, but to the organizations like Fame Church.
Fame Church remains really a pillar of the LA Black community, just as it has been since 1872 when Biddy co-founded it. The members of Fame Church are very consciously living Biddy's legacy.
I feel Biddy's presence most in the people that work in her legacy, like Jackie Broxton. And I see, people that have worked with and the difference Jackie's made in their lives. And I'm like, yeah, I can feel Biddy's legacy in that.
They see Biddy's legacy in people like Jackie, who every day try to make life better for foster youth.
And people like Sky Leah Ross.
Jackie connected us with Sky because she exemplifies what Biddy Mason's legacy is all about.
My name is Sky Leah Ross. I am a doctoral candidate, marriage and family therapist, and trauma therapist. I'm a former foster youth, which is what got me connected with the Biddy Mason Foundation. I received one of their scholarships, and so I've been involved with the organization ever since.
Biddy was separated from her parents as a child. Sky similarly had to make her way in life without caring parents to guide her.
I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. I didn't know what college was.
After enduring an abusive childhood, Sky entered the foster care system. As a teen, school was her refuge. Because of her academic excellence, she was chosen for a special program, one that sends high school students to UCLA for a summer of intense learning.
But that introduced me to what higher learning was, and that gave me access to that. I was like, oh, wow, this is something people do.
So as a senior, she applied and got into UCLA. Sky started seeking scholarships, including the one from the Biddy Mason Charitable Foundation for Foster Youth. And that was the first time she had ever heard the name Biddy Mason.
I did not learn about her when I was in high school or when I was taking classes that talked about Black history. She was never mentioned. And to know that she was right in my backyard, to know that she was in Los Angeles, that would have been so inspiring to know that there was a public figure here on this soil, on this ground, who did so many breakthroughs.
Once at UCLA, Sky became a gender studies major.
And I loved that so much because it gives you the tools to articulate the struggles that you live on a daily basis, things that we all go through, but we don't necessarily know how to talk about them. The less that we know, the less power we have. And so I think education is really a solution to that.
Biddy never learned to write, but she believed so strongly in the power of education that she created schools for African-American children. Sky is now pursuing her doctorate.
I am doing research specifically on former foster youth and BIPOC and LGBTQIA community, looking at how interpersonal trauma, child maltreatment translates into health conditions over time, looking at the outcomes, as well as resilience and coping skills.
Sky works as a therapist for an organization called Peace Over Violence that aids survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Sky helps these people work through the kinds of traumas that Biddy and her enslaved friends had to suffer constantly.
Sky, like Biddy, has chosen a career that allows her to give back to her community and support others.
To see how resilient Biddy Mason really was and to see how much she accomplished and how much she gave to her community. When I take my photos, my professional photos with my cap and gown and everything, I'm going to post, I am my ancestors' wildest dreams and my oppressor's worst nightmare. Yeah, I do think a lot about our ancestors, and I think about all of the barriers that they have. I think about how much they had to overcome, and that is very inspiring. And that does push me to do even better and to hope that I can pave the way for the future generations. I hope that if my ancestors inspire me and I have heroes that came before me, I hope to be a hero for others.
Over 130 years after Biddy's death, she is still a hero, showing Sky, Jackie, and everyone touched by her story how to move forward.
Thank you for listening to Urban Roots, brought to you by Urbanist Media. Your hosts are me, Dahlia Hussein Wetzel, and Vanessa Quirk.
Special thanks to all those who made this episode possible. Laura Voice and George, Kevin Waite, Jackie Broxton, and Sally Berenger Gordon.
Thanks also to my friends Jane Slater and Adrian Stucker. Connor Lynch edited and Andrew Calloway mixed this episode.
Our music is by Adam James Levin Arity. You can check out Adam's band, Lost Amsterdam, at amsterdamlost.com.
If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. To support Urban Roots and help us tell more little-known stories of urban history, please give us a good rating on Apple Podcasts or donate to us via Patreon at Urban Roots Podcast.
Till next time.
Bye, y'all.
Whenever we have to make major decisions on the board, like, are we going to do this? Should we do that? Somebody always says, well, what would Biddy do?
It's almost like she has a leadership role.
She does. She wakes me up in the middle of the night. Are you kidding?
That's really incredible.